listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. Last week was Podcast Movement in Washington, D.C., and so that means this week we get to talk about it. Yay. So yeah, the event took place in Washington, D.C., or just a little outside of Washington, D.C. last week. It had the most amazing weather ever. It was absolutely beautiful coming from Florida. I was so excited to spend some time in just a perfect climate, which I know is very rare for that part of the country, but it was lovely. So I wanted to start by talking about who actually attends Podcast Movement. And I think one of the interesting pieces for me at this event was talking to, those that were attending and having them ask me, "Oh, who are you meeting with at this event? Like, why does True Native Media come to this event?" So myself and my sellers and my VP all attended the event. So there were 6 of us that attended. And I just did some calculations. It was the 13th Podcast Movement that I have attended, which is totally bonkers to me. But nonetheless, it is definitely one of my favorite events of the year. And as I was saying, I was thinking about who is actually attending Podcast Movement. So I wanted to start by breaking that down for you. So obviously, at Podcast Movement, we hope that there are going to be podcasters, right? Like that's kind of the crux of the industry. It's one of the most important pieces. So yes, there are a lot of podcasters who attend the event. I think it's really fascinating when we look at podcasters because we can break them down into all kinds of different groups. The chances are, if you are uber successful, you're probably not going to any of the conferences. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. I know one of my favorite podcasters is Stephen Bartlett. He is the host of the Diary of a CEO show, and he did do a keynote speech at the event. I was really hoping I might just run into him in the halls, get to say hello. Did I see Stephen? No, but I was in meetings most of the time. So it does seem like a lot of times the uber successful podcasters aren't necessarily attending, but you've got a lot of podcasters that do attend the show. The other segment that attends the event in droves is software companies, right? So as with anything that we're working on in this new economy, software is the name of the game, and software shows up to a Podcast Movement in a big way. You have every software you can think of, right? You've got, of course, all of the hosting providers that are going to be there. And then you have all of the auxiliary tools that are being created. And that might be something to help you run your show better. That might be something to help market a podcast better. That might be software to help run ads better, right? There is lots and lots of software that is there. And it's great to have them because they do contribute so substantially to the industry. We are a software industry. And I know that we kind of debate that sometimes, right? Like, especially with advertisers. Are we online? Are we offline? Where exactly are we falling in all of this? But without technology, we would not have podcasts. So we are definitely in the technology industry and the technology space. So having software there is really important. And I would say that there's also a level of just industry professionals, and you could classify those as people who are working in software. You could classify them as the researchers, the people that create different networking groups around podcasts, right? There are just a lot of industry individuals that are at the events as well, which is great to see. And then you have, of course, companies like True Native Media. So companies that are representing podcasts. You also have a lot of network owners that attend the events. And then last but not least, there are a lot of brands and agencies that will attend Podcast Movement. if you take a company like, like let's say DraftKings, I met the guy that heads up podcast ad buying for DraftKings while I was there. And DraftKings does buy through an agency, but it was great to meet him, right? He's at the event because DraftKings invests in a big way in podcast advertising. So it makes sense for those brands to come to the event to meet with their partners, right? To meet with the representation firms, to meet with the networks, to meet with the hosts. If we can create this environment for that advertiser and show them the value of what they're investing in real, tangible, face-to-face ways, it's definitely very powerful. And of course, all of the agencies that are working with these brands as well are going to be attending the event. I wanted to talk a little bit about what True Native Media did at the event. And the reason I wanted to bring it was because, as I mentioned, I had several people come up to me and say, oh, well, who are you meeting with? And, the first thing that comes to mind is that we're there to meet with talent, that we're there to meet with podcasters. And we love our talent. We love our podcasters. We had actually a couple of different dinners that we attended with the hosts that we represent, and they were lovely. There is nothing better than meeting someone face to face that you've been working with for years. And we definitely do want to create that connection with our hosts, connect with hosts at events. However, we are not the type of company where we are trying to line up tons and tons of meetings at Podcast Movement with creators and with hosts. And the reason why is that we have found that it is a little spotty on who exactly attends, right? If we're thinking that there are somewhere between 2 and 4 million podcasts out there, I realize that's a huge range, but there are millions of podcasts out there. And at an event like Podcast Movement, I don't know for sure how many people attend. I think it's around a couple thousand. You're not going to get, of course, every host at the event. And so for us, oftentimes, a host that we're talking to and we're trying to negotiate may or may not be at Podcast Movement. But who is at Podcast Movement that is really important for us are our agency partners and brands that are purchasing advertising. So with True Native Media in particular, we have essentially two customers, right? We have the podcaster, we have the creator. We have to make sure that we have on point and wonderful content. But on the flip side, we have to sell advertising. That is our role. We sell sales, right? That's what we do at our company. We sell things. And so we need to connect with those partners. That's very, very important to us. And it's really terrific to have an event like Podcast Movement that is so podcast focused. There are lots and lots of media events that take place throughout the country and throughout the world. But the value of Podcast Movement is that it is very podcast centric. It's very podcast focused. And so while other events I think are important for us as an industry to attend, because we do want to have fresh conversations, we do want to go out there and network with others and bring them into the podcast fold. So being at those events, I think, is equally important. The value of Podcast Movement is it is so focused in on our industry. And for us in particular, I went through and I counted, and we met with 23 different brands and agencies. We actually had 30 meetings over 2.5 days, and we met with 23 different agencies and brands who are interested in buying advertising. That time is so incredibly valuable for our team, because as much as we would love to take market trips and see everyone face to face in their own setting, in their own office, that costs a lot of money to travel around the country and see everyone. And secondly, I think one of the things that's been so interesting is post-pandemic, the office environment is just not the same as it used to be. Used to be able to show up to an agency, everyone was there and it was easy to have conversations. And now many of our agency partners either have distributed workforces where they don't have an office, or they have a really small percentage of their team that's actually going to be in office. So being able to go to an event and talk to people face to face about podcast advertising was really, really invaluable. The other thing that is really neat is that I have been in this industry now for almost 9 years, which is crazy. And there are buyers that we talked to at this event that were like, I'm so excited. I finally got to attend my first podcast movement. Maybe they were people who have been buying in this space for several years, but they've either just gotten to that place in their company where they've risen up the ranks high enough that their name was thrown into their hat to go ahead and go to podcast movement or whatever it is. They have an opportunity to go to podcast movement, and the buyers like connecting with the sellers just as much, right? And so having that, I think, camaraderie is just so important and so invaluable. When I think about the success of the event, definitely those conversations are so crucial and so critical to the development of the industry. And there are so many different conversations happening right now, right? And one of the things that I think we all have to remember is that when you are present at industry events, you are part of the conversation. Now, we can definitely have conversations online, and we do, right? We can have conversations in Slack channels and all kinds of different forums that are out there for us to talk in. But the reality is, at the end of the day, that connection face to face is so important. And I think it's really valuable to be at an event and to get a pulse on how things are actually happening and unfolding in the space. Whether or not we agree with that information, I think is, maybe that is not irrelevant, essentially, right? Like our contribution to the industry and our contribution to the conversation, I think, is the most important piece. And so as we think about developing as an industry and we think about paving a way to make it easier for advertisers to come into the space, for us to continue to really create the value that we're looking to create in the industry, we need to make sure that we are part of that conversation. And being there face to face is really a critical piece of that. I think the other thing that is really important is that the podcast industry does tend to be a little bit disorganized in some ways, right? And I was thinking about it. There is beauty in that disorganization. And what I mean by disorganization is that there isn't a central place where you can go and just instantly buy all the shows. There isn't a place where we know every podcast is there. I talk about things like this frequently, but this morning I had a particular topic that I was really interested in hearing about, and I searched that topic. When I'm looking for a topic, I always go to Spotify because, in my opinion, it's the best search engine for podcast content. I came up with two podcasts around this particular topic. And one of them, the episode was a minute long. So essentially, the episode was like 11 minutes long. So essentially, there was really no content around this. And I went to YouTube and there was tons of content, right? So I really believe that the content I was looking for exists out there somewhere in the podcast land. I just had a hard time accessing that. And that's one of the challenges with this space, is that we do have a level of disorganization and we are working to try and unify, but we also have to remember the value of the podcast industry is the individual contributor. It is beautiful that we can all get together as an industry and all have our own role to play within this whole ecosphere. Because when we think about other channels, when we think about social channels, when we think about YouTube, they are very easy to buy and execute on, but we also have a really narrow piece, especially within the technology space, that's actually really in control of what's happening, right? Meta's in control, Google's in control. And isn't it beautiful that in the podcast space, we have this ability to have a level of independence and contribute in that way that is unique to each of us? I think that that's part of what makes the podcast space really just a beautiful plan. So while sometimes I think we can have volatile conversations and, there can be strong opinions, being part of that conversation and being able to contribute to what it is that we're building as an industry, I think is really super valuable. In terms of takeaways from the event, As I just mentioned, I have so many meetings when I'm at Podcast Movement and I love them. What that means is that I don't have the ability to attend all of the sessions, and the sessions will be coming out in recorded form here, I'm guessing, in a couple of weeks. And at that time, I can certainly consume that content. Really excited because I did, as I said, have lots of team members that were there, and we are going to be going through all the sessions that they attended, trying to glean some information. So I'm interested to hear what is out there. But what did I hear in the conversations that I had? Because in my opinion, those conversations were probably some of the better, right? Because we're talking about advertising. So what are advertisers? What are agencies looking for? The things that I heard again and again, which just thrills me, is that these folks are more interested in run of network campaigns than I think they have ever been. Now, what is a run of network campaign? A run of network campaign is a campaign that is going to run across an entire slate of shows. And that ad is typically going to be a producer-read ad. And it's going to run, I would say, in almost a pseudo programmatic way that we can get the campaign out there. We can run the campaign for a month or 3 months, whatever that time frame would be. We can deliver a lot of impressions, and we can also deliver a lot of value because there is so much power in that host read ad, but it is a little heavier in terms of execution, right? We have to get product samples. We have to get the host to do an ad read themselves, and then we have to schedule it on each individual podcast. Whereas with Run of Network, it's very easy to set it up to deliver across a whole slate of shows. And the other value for the advertiser is that it does come in at a lower price point. So there is a lot of power in Run of Network campaigns. And I feel like I just want to kind of shout from the rooftops, this is happening, because when I started True Native Media, part of the vision that I had was aggregating smaller shows together to try and sell them together. And when I started, that was just not doable. No one was purchasing like that. But people are now open to purchasing this way, where we're able to say, hey, let's go ahead and put these together. You're buying that demographic, you're buying that audience, not necessarily that particular show. So very excited about that. Next, there were lots of talk about 360 campaigns. What is a 360 campaign? A 360 campaign is a campaign that not only includes podcast ads, but will include other assets as well. So we might be talking about inclusion in newsletter. We might be talking about social posts. We might be talking about getting in the YouTube channel for that particular content creator. But if you think about it, and I've talked about this before on the show, looking at this individual as a content creator and less as a podcaster, I think is something we really need to lean into. Now, if someone has a really uber successful YouTube channel, we're still going to call it a YouTube channel at the end of the day, right? And if somebody has an uber successful podcast, we're still going to call them a podcaster at the end of the day. So there's nothing wrong with us creating these content creators and talking about them and thinking about them that way, because this integration is really powerful for the brand. The brand isn't just getting in front of the podcast listeners, they're getting in front of that content creators' entire catalog. And so there's a lot of power in that. And I think that we really need to lean into that, because advertisers are interested in that. And if advertisers are interested in that, that's what we need to give them, right? That's what they want. So I think that that's really important. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was hitting the long tail of advertising. So lots and lots of programmatic discussion, and we know that we're going to continue to go down that path, which there's a lot of power in programmatic. I've talked about that. I had the pleasure of moderating a panel, and we talked about reaching beyond the top 500 podcasts. We discussed that 44% of ad spend is happening on that kind of top 500 podcast list, but it's only reaching 12% of podcast listeners. So that means that 88% of the addressable podcast audience is totally being missed. And so really, how can we get out there? How can we get that 88% of the market? And in my panel, we discussed different ways to do that. We talked about programmatic buys. We talked about run of network buys, like I had mentioned. We talked about even using tools like Podchaser, for instance, to go out and find shows so that you could execute on that. So there's a lot of power in the long tail of podcasting. And that programmatic piece, I do think, is a bit of a linchpin because it is so much easier to execute on a programmatic buy to get into some of the smaller shows. So those were really kind of the biggest takeaways that I had from the event. You know, I do believe that because Podcast Movement is the largest US based podcast event, that it is extremely valuable to the industry. And I think we really need to make sure that we're, continuing to attend the event, that we're continuing to support the event, because at the end of the day, if the podcasters are there and the advertisers are there, that's where we need to be as an industry as well. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have enjoyed creating it for you. If you haven't had a chance to go and check out my YouTube channel, head on over there. Got some great content for you over there. I am working on some amazing new ads for you. So make sure that you tune in next week and I will have another great episode for you. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for listening to the Podcast to Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast to advertising industry.